March 19, 1945. 32,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley, inside the waist gun position of a B-17 Flying Fortress, Staff Sergeant Henry "Red" Erwin couldn't see. Blood filled both eye sockets. Shrapnel had shredded his face 3 minutes earlier. The aircraft was under attack by 12 FW190s. His gun was the only thing standing between those fighters and the bomber's unprotected belly. He had never fired it blind before. No one had. What happened in the next 90 seconds would determine whether 23 men lived or died, and it would rewrite the training manual for every aerial gunner in the European theater. The B-17 wasn't designed to be survivable. It was designed to deliver bombs and absorb punishment long enough to get there. Boeing's engineers knew the mathematics cold. A fully loaded Fortress carried 6,000 pounds of ordnance, 2,500 gallons of aviation fuel, 11,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and 10 men packed into an aluminum tube 7 feet wide. One incendiary round in the right place, and the whole thing became a fireball at 200 miles per hour. The solution wasn't armor. There wasn't enough weight budget for that. The solution was guns. 13 Browning M2 machine guns, each capable of 800 rounds per minute, arranged to create overlapping fields of fire across every approach angle. The theory was elegant. Concentrate enough defensive firepower, and you make the cost of attack prohibitive. But theory assumed your gunners could see. It assumed they were conscious. It assumed they weren't bleeding out at altitude where the temperature sat at 40 below zero. Henry Erwin was 22 years old. He'd grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, working in his father's machine shop since he was 12. He understood tolerances, clearances, and how mechanisms failed under stress. He'd enlisted in 1943, scored high on mechanical aptitude, and been assigned to gunnery school. The training was exhaustive. Trainees learned to field strip and reassemble the Browning blindfolded because night combat and smoke made visibility unreliable. They learned to estimate lead angles by sound when tracers gave away your position. They learned to clear jams by feel because you couldn't always see inside the receiver when rounds were cooking off. Erwin was good at it. Not exceptional, not a natural, just methodical and calm under pressure. He'd flown 18 missions as a waist gunner on a crew that had never lost a man. That record was about to be tested. The mission was a daylight raid on a synthetic oil plant outside Gelsenkirchen. The 381st Bomb Group had put up 24 aircraft in 3 ship elements. Erwin's plane, Devil's Daughter, was flying in the low squadron, the most vulnerable position in the formation. German fighters always hit the low squadron first because it had the least mutual defensive support. The Luftwaffe was desperate by March 1945. Fuel was scarce. Experienced pilots were dead, but desperation made them aggressive. The attack came at 08:47 hours, 12 Focke-Wulf 190s diving out of the sun in a coordinated assault. The lead fighter opened fire at 400 yards. 20mm cannon shells walked up the fuselage. One punched through the waist window and detonated against the gun mount 6 inches from Erwin's head. The explosion was small. Cannon shells aren't designed for blast effect. They're designed to fragment. The casing disintegrated into hundreds of jagged metal shards traveling at supersonic velocity. 3 pieces hit Erwin's face. One severed his left optic nerve. One punctured his right eye. One opened his forehead to the bone. He was blind before he understood he'd been hit. The pain came second. Then the blood. Head wounds bleed catastrophically because the scalp is dense with capillaries, and there's no way to apply pressure while wearing a flight helmet. Blood poured into his eyes, his nose, his throat. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe properly. The temperature was 42 below zero, and his face was exposed to the slipstream through the shattered window. Frostbite set in within seconds. Any rational assessment said he was done. He should have collapsed. He should have gone into shock. He didn't. Erwin's gun was still operational. He could hear it. The Browning M2 has a distinctive sound, a deep, hammering rhythm that's unmistakable even through a leather flight helmet and the roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines. His gun was silent. The other guns were firing. He could hear the ball turret below him, the tail guns behind him, the top turret forward. But his position was quiet, and that meant the belly approach was undefended. FW190s were fast and smart. They'd notice. He reached for the gun. His hands found the spade grips by muscle memory. The weapon was still charged. He could feel the tension in the recoil spring. He pulled the trigger. Nothing. Jam. The explosion had knocked the belt feed out of alignment. He cleared it by feel, pulled the charging handle, felt the bolt slam forward, pulled the trigger again. The gun fired. He couldn't see what he was shooting at. He couldn't see anything, just blood and darkness and the occasional flash of light that might have been his damaged optic nerve misfiring or might have been muzzle flash. He did the only thing that made sense. He listened. Sound became his targeting system. The FW190 used a BMW 801 radial engine, 14 cylinders, 1,700 horsepower, with a very specific acoustic signature. It sounded different from the Fortress's Wright Cyclones, higher pitched, angrier. Erwin tracked that sound. When it got louder, the fighter was closing. When it Dopplered down, it was breaking off. He fired in bursts, traversing the gun left and right across the approach cone, hosing the airspace where the sound was loudest. He couldn't aim. He could only saturate. The Browning's rate of fire was 800 rounds per minute. That's 13 rounds per second. He fired 3-second bursts. 39 rounds. Per burst. He had 600 rounds in the belt. 15 bursts. He used them all in 90 seconds. He had no idea if he hit anything. He just knew the sound of the BMW engines kept getting louder, and then suddenly they weren't there anymore. The fighters broke off at 0849 hours. Total engagement time, 2 minutes, 18 seconds. The bomber formation tightened up and continued to target. Erwin collapsed. The co-pilot came back and found him unconscious, face destroyed, the gun still warm. They got a tourniquet around his head, which shouldn't work, but sometimes does enough to slow the bleeding. They gave him morphine. They radioed ahead for an ambulance. The plane landed at 10:34 hours. Erwin was in surgery by 1100. The surgeons saved his life but couldn't save his eyes. Both were too damaged. He was blind. Permanently, at 22. But the plane had made it back. All 10 crew. No one else hit. The bomb run had been successful. And when they examined the wreckage around Erwin's gun position, they found something interesting. There was blood on the spade grips. There was blood on the trigger. There was blood on the belt feed. But there was also something else. Embedded in the gun mount, they found fragments of aluminum and perspex. Not from the bomber, from a canopy. An FW190 canopy. Erwin had hit something. They didn't know what. Not until 3 days later, when a reconnaissance flight photographed a crash site 11 miles from the bomber stream. One Focke-Wulf 190, tail number unknown, impacted at high speed. The pilot hadn't bailed out. The aircraft had gone straight in. Ballistics analysis of the wreckage showed .50 caliber damage to the engine cowling and cockpit. The angle of impact matched the trajectory from a waist gun position. Erwin had shot down a fighter he couldn't see. The mechanics were fascinatingly simple. Erwin hadn't aimed. He'd saturated. The FW190's attack profile was predictable. Fighters dove from altitude, built up speed, closed to 200 yards, fired, and broke away. The approach cone was narrow, maybe 15 degrees of arc. Erwin had hosed that entire cone with 600 rounds in 90 seconds. The math was brutal. 15 degrees of arc at 200 yards is roughly 50 feet wide. 600 rounds across 50 feet. That's 12 rounds per linear foot. The FW190 had a wingspan of 34 feet. Flying through that cone meant flying through 408 rounds. The fighter only needed to catch one in the engine or cockpit. It caught several. The pilot died instantly. The plane augured in. Erwin never knew. He was unconscious when it happened. The Army awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, not the Medal of Honor, the DSC, second highest decoration. The citation was bureaucratic. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. It didn't mention that he'd been blind. It didn't mention the 90 seconds. It didn't mention that he'd invented a new gunnery technique under the worst possible conditions. Erwin was medically discharged in June 1945. He went home to Birmingham, learned Braille, worked in his father's machine shop by touch, married, had 3 kids, died in 1989. His obituary in the Birmingham News was 4 sentences long. It mentioned his DSC. It didn't mention the fighter. But the Air Force noticed. Erwin's action appeared in a classified after-action report that circulated through Training Command. The report was clinical. It analyzed the engagement as a case study in sensory substitution and area saturation. It noted that visual targeting wasn't always necessary if the gunner understood geometry and acoustics. It recommended modifications to training. By August 1945, gunnery schools were teaching blind fire techniques. Trainees practiced tracking targets by engine sound. They practiced saturation fire across predicted approach cones. They practiced clearing jams without looking. The techniques were used in Korea, in Vietnam. Modern close-in weapon systems use the same principle. The Phalanx CIWS doesn't aim at incoming missiles. It saturates the approach cone with 4,500 rounds per minute. Erwin figured that out at 32,000 feet with blood in his eyes. The lesson isn't about heroism. It's about systems and failure modes. The B-17's defensive system assumed functional gunners. It had no backup plan for incapacitation. Erwin created one. He turned a catastrophic failure into a functional workaround by understanding what the gun actually needed to do. It didn't need precision. It needed volume in the right place at the right time. That's a design principle. Modern aircraft don't rely on human gunners anymore because humans are the failure point. But the principle remains. Redundancy isn't about duplication. It's about alternative methods that achieve the same effect when primary systems fail. Erwin proved that at 22, with a face full of shrapnel and 90 seconds to live. There's a Browning M2 in the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson. It's mounted in a waist gun position from a B-17. The placard says it's from the 381st Bomb Group. It doesn't say it's Erwin's gun. It might be. It might not. It looks ordinary. 50 caliber, air-cooled, belt-fed, 65 pounds of steel and springs. But somewhere in the museum's archives is a maintenance record from March 1945 that notes, blood on receiver, gun operational. That's the whole story. The gun worked. The gunner couldn't see. The fighter went down anyway. In the mathematics of survival, sometimes you don't need to see the enemy. You just need to fill the space where they have to be. Your orders, should you choose to accept them, remember that the most critical systems aren't the ones that never fail. They're the ones that keep fighting when failure seems certain. Subscribe and join the ranks of those who understand that history's greatest victories often came from soldiers who refused to let impossible odds write the ending.